Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe to help support the channel. I hope you have a great Super Bowl weekend. Now let's read some creepy stories. People still talk about that game. Weeks later, it was everywhere. Sports blogs, social media, even the nightly news. One of those moments people can't stop dissecting, breaking it down frame by frame like it holds some deeper meaning. The kick heard around the country, they called it. And yeah, on the surface, it was the kind of championship moment players dream about, the kind that gets replayed on highlight reels, frozen in time like something legendary. But for me, the game itself isn't what matters. It's everything that came after. The things people don't know. The things they wouldn't want to know. It all started with that championship. Blue Devils versus the Tigers. 2020. Clock winding down. 1 point to win it all. The crowd was deafening. Thousands of voices screaming in unison, feet stomping the bleachers like a pulse, a living, breathing entity hungry for blood. The kind of energy that could drive a man insane. Coach didn't hesitate. He made the call, and the field goal unit jogged onto the field. No second guessing. No debate. Everyone knew who was taking the kick. Me. Jogging out there, I could feel the weight of thousands of eyes locked onto me. The whole season had built to this. It didn't rattle me. Pressure never did. Some guys crack under it, hesitate, let their minds get loud and messy. I didn't have that problem. The noise, the tension, it funneled into something cold and quiet inside me, a steady hum beneath my skin. Coach was pacing the sideline as I got into position. His fingers drummed against his clipboard, a nervous tick he never seemed to shake. Then he leaned toward one of the assistants, muttered something too low for anyone else to hear. A nod, a quick exchange, subtle but intentional. And then, there it was. Not one of the regulation footballs we practiced with. Not one of the ones fresh from the rack, scuffed from weeks of use. This one was different. My ball. They handed it off smoothly, too smoothly, like it was nothing, like there weren't thousands of people watching. But to someone paying close attention, it would have looked strange, deliberate. And someone was paying attention. Across the field, the Tigers' head coach saw it. His eyes narrowed, and a second later, he was storming toward the refs, gesturing wildly. "They're swapping it," he roared. "That's not a regulation ball. Check it." The refs didn't even blink. Maybe they were too caught up in the moment. Or maybe they already knew. I took my time, placed the ball in my holder's hands, ran my fingers over the laces, checked the angle. Perfect. Just like always. The wind had picked up, gusting sharp and brutal across the field, but I didn't let it distract me. I had kicked in worse conditions. On the other side of the line, the Tigers' defensive players twitched in their stances, ready to lunge the second the ball moved. Their coach was still screaming, red-faced and desperate, but the refs ignored him, waving for the game to continue. I almost smiled. They thought they could stop me. From the corner of my eye, I caught two Tigers players exchanging glances. Bill and Frank, their faces tight with suspicion. They had noticed something. Didn't matter. The snap came fast, the ball steady in its place before I even took my first step. Time slowed. The world faded. One step. Two. Contact. The sound of my foot meeting the ball cut through the noise like a gunshot. It soared high, perfect rotation, perfect arc. I didn't watch it land. I didn't have to. The eruption of the crowd told me everything. Blue Devils 21, Tigers 20. For a moment, everything blurred. Faces screaming, arms grabbing me, bodies crashing together in celebration. I was hoisted onto shoulders, carried across the field in a wave of hands and shouting voices. Pete, one of the linebackers, pounded a hand against my back hard enough to sting. "Tad, you're a goddamn legend," he hollered, voice raw. I only shrugged, smiling just enough. I'd rather have a drink. That's what people liked about me, I think. That steady composure. Never too much, never rattled. But I saw it in their faces, the way they looked at me, like I was something more than a kicker, something other. The adrenaline of victory faded as the night wore on. The crowd thinned. The cameras stopped flashing. The questions ended. Inside, I had already moved on, because the game was over. But the real work had only just begun. Things got weird fast after that. The Tigers coach wouldn't let it go. Said he saw something. Said the ball wasn't right. "You swapped it," he shouted as we left the field. "I saw you swap it." That's when the whispers started. At first, just fragments, bits of conversations caught in passing. Then names started surfacing. Bill and Frank. They weren't just suspicious. They were obsessed. I caught them talking in the tunnel a few days later. "That ball wasn't right," Frank muttered. Bill nodded. "It didn't move right." I heard their names again the following week. The rumors had spread beyond them. People weren't just questioning that kick anymore. They were questioning all of them. 97 straight extra points. Not one miss. Not one bad snap. Not one fluke. Not possible. Coach told us to ignore it. "People talk when they lose," he said. "Don't give them the satisfaction." But it wasn't going away. I heard about it from one of the equipment guys a few days later. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot like he wasn't sure if he should even be talking to me. "You didn't hear this from me," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "But they're saying you've got some kind of trick ball. That it's rigged. Cursed." I exhaled through my nose, slow and easy, and gave him a small shrug. People need to believe in something, I guess. He laughed, but it didn't sound real. "Yeah, I guess." I didn't care what they believed. Let them talk. Let them dissect the footage. Slow it down. Zoom in. They weren't going to find anything. But Bill and Frank weren't like the others. They weren't content with rumors. They wanted proof. And they weren't letting it go. I noticed them lurking around the locker room after practice, pretending to fill their water bottles, stretching just a little longer than necessary. Their eyes kept drifting to the equipment bins. They were waiting for a chance to get their hands on it. I let it play out for a few days, watching them watch me. Then, one evening, when the locker room had mostly cleared, I walked past them and stopped. "What are you looking for?" I asked, my voice flat. Bill turned too quickly, trying to play it off. "What?" "Oh, nothing, man. Just curious," Frank cut in. "Wanted to see the ball you used. You know, for curiosity's sake." I held his gaze for a long moment before shaking my head. "Sorry, guy. You gotta be a Blue Devil to handle this gear. Nobody touches these footballs but us." They forced a couple of stiff chuckles. I walked away without another word. That should have been the end of it. But they weren't the type to give up. I noticed them again a few nights later, following me, not even trying to be subtle about it. Frank's old beat-up truck, headlights off, trailing too far back to seem casual. I almost smiled. They thought they were the ones doing the hunting. I let them follow me, led them down the winding roads outside town, stretching the drive longer than usual, past the fields, past the closed gas station, past the last flicker of streetlights. My house sat at the edge of the woods. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees and silence. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't turn the lights on. I didn't need them. I sat in my truck for a moment, listening. The engine idled at the end of the road. They were waiting, debating. Then, just before midnight, I heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel. I stayed still. Frank's voice, a whisper. "Are we really doing this?" Bill's reply came fast, hushed, and urgent. "We have to. If we get that ball, we have proof." I let them move, let them find the basement window. It was unlocked. They slid it open, hesitated, then climbed inside. I heard their breathing first, shallow, uneven. Then, the rustle of fabric as they stepped closer. Then, silence. They were staring at the table, the tools, the half-stitched football sitting in the center, the overhead light casting a soft gleam over its reddish surface. A pause. Then, "Jesus," Frank whispered. Bill took a step closer. "What the hell is all this?" Frank's voice was tight. This is some kind of lab, man." The panic was setting in. I could hear it in the way their breathing changed. Frank's voice dropped lower. "Knives and needles? What kind of stuff is this guy into?" Bill exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "It's here," he murmured. "The ball. The one he used. That's it. That's the proof." Frank took a step back. "We shouldn't be here." Bill wasn't listening. His fingers brushed over the half-stitched ball. He stilled. This doesn't feel right." Frank backed up further toward the window. "Bill, let's go." Bill turned the ball over in his hands, his breath hitching. "This isn't..." He swallowed hard. "This isn't leather." That's when I moved. The chair creaked. They froze, and I spoke. "Looking for something?" My voice was calm, almost conversational. I'd been standing in the shadows by the stairs, waiting, watching. I let the silence stretch, let their breathing fill the space. Then, when I was sure they couldn't bolt, I stepped forward, into the dim light. They froze. Bill still had the ball in his hands. Frank spun too fast, nearly losing his balance. Their eyes were wide, darting between me and the table, their thoughts scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, some way to talk their way out of this. I let the moment hang before I spoke. "You've been busy," I said, voice even. "Following me, sneaking around, breaking into my house." A small shake of my head. Most people would have given up by now. Frank swallowed hard. His voice came out thin. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it. We just..." "You just what?" I cut in. "Got curious. Wanted to know what makes me different." Bill squared his shoulders, trying to mask the fear with false confidence. "We know what you did," he said. "You switched the ball during the game. The whole team was in on it." His voice wavered slightly. "That ball, it's not normal." I tilted my head slightly. "And what gave it away?" Neither of them answered right away. "Was it the weight?" I continued. "The color? Or was it the way it always works?" I took another slow step forward. "You're right. There was a switch." Bill's grip on the ball tightened. His jaw flexed, his brain working overtime. "But it's not the ball you should be worried about," I said. "It's what's in it." The room felt smaller. Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "What does that mean?" I nodded toward the table, toward the unfinished ball. "Go ahead," I said. "You've come this far. Might as well know the truth." Frank didn't move. "But Bill..." Bill's curiosity got the better of him. He turned the ball over in his hands, running his fingers across the seams, across the stretched, polished surface. His breathing hitched. He pressed down slightly, feeling the unnatural give beneath his fingertips. His fingers traced something embedded in the grain. A faint ridge, like scar tissue. His eyes flicked to me. "This..." His throat bobbed. "This isn't leather." I smiled. His face twisted, horror dawning slowly, creeping over him in waves. His voice barely audible. "What is this?" I didn't answer. Frank did. His voice was raw. "Bill, drop it." Bill just stood there, still holding it, still feeling it, like his body hadn't caught up with his mind yet. Then his hand snapped open and the ball hit the floor with a dull thud. Frank turned to me, shaking his head, like he was trying to unsee, unfeel, undo whatever had just clicked into place in his brain. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Bill took a step back, but his legs weren't steady. Frank grabbed his arm. "We need to go." They turned toward the stairs. I was already moving. The shotgun was in my hands before they reached the first step. I didn't aim at them. Not yet. Just fired once. Into the ceiling. The blast shook the walls. They froze. I exhaled slowly. "Not so fast." Frank flinched. Bill raised his hand slightly, eyes locked on the shotgun. "Look, man," he said carefully. We won't say anything, okay? We'll just..." I let out a quiet laugh. He stopped talking. "Oh, I know I won't see you again." I tilted my head slightly. "But not because you're walking out of here." Frank let out a shaky breath. His hands were trembling. "Please." I let the silence stretch. Then finally I spoke. "You should be proud," I said. "You're going to be part of something bigger than yourselves." The room felt cold. Frank moved first. Bill tried to follow. But it was over before it started. The following season, the Blue Devils opened with another win. My kicks, as always, were flawless. No one noticed the new footballs. They never do. But if someone had looked closely, if they had run their fingers over the surface, really felt it, they might have found something. A faint ridge, a small inked mark, 2 letters, BPFH. Some victories come at a cost. But perfection? Perfection demands a price. and I've never had a problem paying it. The first time I saw Chappie Halstead, I knew he was different. Not better, not worse, just different. It was late August, the air thick with the kind of humidity that makes every breath feel like a weight in your chest. The first week of football practice always had that smell of freshly cut grass mixed with sweat and ambition, and that year was no exception. We were seniors now, me, Liam, Andre, and a couple others, and the pressure was suffocating. Briar Ridge didn't tolerate mediocrity. Chappie arrived like he already belonged, tall, lean, and wearing a confident smirk that I couldn't tell was cocky or genuine. "New kid," Liam muttered under his breath, nudging me as Chappie approached the field. "What's his deal?" I didn't have an answer then. But now, looking back, I wish I'd trusted the pit I felt in my stomach the moment we shook hands. There was something in his eyes, even then, an intensity that didn't seem to match the way he casually introduced himself. Like he wasn't really paying attention to us. Like he was looking past us. A few days later, after practice, we took him to see the monuments. It was a tradition, I guess. Every new player had to walk that row, learn the names, understand what they were playing for. At least that's what Coach always said. Really, I think it was a way to keep us all in line, to remind us that we weren't just playing a game. We were playing for legacy. The monuments stood in a neat row just outside the stadium gates, a line of polished granite busts with stern faces staring down anyone who dared look back. They weren't just decorations. They were practically sacred. Each one bore the name of a Briar Ridge legend, along with their jersey number and a few words about their accomplishments. Tiger Walsh, number 14, unstoppable. Doug Harvey, number 7, heart of the team. The names blurred together after a while, but you couldn't help feeling small when you stood there. "This is where the real legends live," Andre said, clapping a hand on Chappie's shoulder as we reached the first bust. "You play well enough. Maybe you'll end up here one day." Chappie didn't respond right away. He just walked slowly down the line, his hand brushing against the cool stone as he passed each monument. When he reached the last one, a newer addition, he stopped and stared for what felt like too long. "Someday," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate, "I'm going to be up there." We laughed because, well, what else do you do? Everyone dreams big when they're new. But there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy. It wasn't a dream. It was a promise. At first, I didn't think much about it. Chappie fit into the team quickly enough, and his work ethic was impressive. He showed up early, stayed late, and put everything he had into practice. Coach loved him, of course. "That's how you build a legacy," he'd shout as Chappie sprinted past the rest of us during drills. And honestly, it was hard not to admire the guy. He wanted it more than anyone I'd ever met. But after a few weeks, things started to feel off. It wasn't just the way Chappie pushed himself harder than anyone else. It was the way he seemed to disappear when practice ended. We'd all head to the locker room, laughing and talking about the day. But Chappie would hang back. At first, I thought he was just putting in extra reps. But one night I spotted him through the chain-link fence that separated the field from the monuments. He was just standing there, staring at them, like he was waiting for them to talk back. "Hey, you good?" I called out. He didn't turn around. "Yeah," he said after a moment, his voice low. "Just thinking." It didn't seem worth pushing. We were all under pressure. Maybe this was just his way of dealing with it. the image of him standing there in the dark stuck with me. As the season went on, Chappie's obsession only grew. He spent every spare moment training, running drills until his legs gave out, studying film like his life depended on it. It was impressive, sure, but it wasn't normal. None of us trained that hard, and none of us could have, even if we'd wanted to. Then there were the nights. I started seeing him out by the monuments more often, always alone, always muttering to himself. Once, after a late practice, I crept closer, trying to hear what he was saying. "They'll remember me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "They have to." It sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to say something, to ask him what the hell he meant, but I didn't. I just stood there in the shadows, watching as he reached out to touch one of the statues, his fingers lingering on the engraved nameplate. By mid-season, Chappie wasn't just a player, he was a machine. He led us to win after win, carrying the team on his back. The crowds loved him, and the scouts started showing up in droves. But the harder he worked, the more he pushed himself to the brink. During one game, he took a hit so hard I thought his leg had snapped clean in two. He limped off the field, but by the next series, he was back out there, running like nothing had happened. Afterward, I caught him in the locker room, wrapping his knee with duct tape. "Jesus, Chappie, you need to sit out," I said. He shook his head, his eyes glazed over with a mix of exhaustion and something else I couldn't place. "I can't," he said. "You don't get remembered by sitting out." It was like he wasn't even there anymore, like the guy I'd met at the beginning of the season had been replaced by someone else, someone colder, harder, and obsessed. The first time he said something about the monuments, it felt like a joke. "They're not just statues, you know," he said as we walked past them one night after practice. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They're graves," he said, deadpan. "They're still here, watching us." I laughed nervously, waiting for him to crack a smile. He didn't. Instead, he turned to look at me, his face unreadable. "You don't get it, do you? They're waiting for the next one." "The next what?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He didn't answer. He just turned back toward the field, leaving me standing there in the dark. That was the moment I realized something was wrong. It wasn't just Chappie's obsession with being remembered. It was something bigger, something I couldn't explain, but I could feel it, creeping in around the edges of everything. By the middle of the season, Chappie was everything the town hoped he'd be. Our star player, the name on everyone's lips, the reason Briar Ridge felt alive on Friday nights. His speed, his precision, the way he could bulldoze through a defensive line like it wasn't even there. It was electric. Every game, the stands were packed, the crowd screaming his name. Scouts started showing up too, lurking at the edge of the field with their clipboards and sunglasses, nodding quietly to each other as Chappie racked up impossible yardage. For a while, I convinced myself it was all good. We were winning after all. Hell, we were unstoppable. But even then, there was this gnawing unease that followed me around like a shadow. Something wasn't right with Chappie, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the signs kept piling up. It started small, little things I could have written off if I hadn't been paying attention. After every game, while the rest of us celebrated with the team, Chappie would wander off. I'd find him near the monuments, standing in the dark, his helmet still tucked under his arm, staring up at those cold stone faces. He wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, just stood there like he was waiting for something. Once, after a particularly brutal game, I worked up the nerve to ask him what he was doing. "Thinking," he said without looking at me. "About what?" "About them." His voice was so flat, so calm, it made my skin crawl. "Chappie, they're just statues, man." He turned to me then, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "No, they're not." The next week he pulled me aside after practice. His knee was still taped up from the last game, and there were bruises on his arms that hadn't been there before. But he didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. "They're talking to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "Who's talking to you?" "The legends," he said. "Tiger Walsh, Doug Harvey, all of them." I wanted to laugh, to tell him to cut it out, but the look on his face stopped me cold. He was serious, dead serious. "In my dreams," he continued, "they tell me what I need to do, how to push harder, how to sacrifice more. They're helping me." "Helping you with what?" "To be great." The words hung between us like a blade. I didn't know what to say. Chappie stared at me, waiting, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You need to take a break," I said finally. "You're pushing yourself too hard." He shook his head. "I can't stop now. You don't understand. They're counting on me." That Friday, we played one of the toughest teams in the state. Everyone knew it was going to be a brutal game, and from the moment we stepped onto the field, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the sky was pressing down on us. Chappie was unstoppable that night. He tore through their defense like it was nothing, scoring twice in the first quarter alone. But there was something about the way he moved, something desperate. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to annihilate them. By halftime, he was limping, favoring his left leg, but he refused to sit out. I caught up to him on the sideline, grabbing his arm before he could head back onto the field. "You're done," I said. "You're not going back out there." He jerked his arm away. "I can't let them down." "Chappie, you're hurt." "I don't care." His voice cracked, raw and strained. For a second I thought he was going to hit me, but then his shoulders slumped and he turned away, muttering to himself, "I can't let them down. I can't." The third quarter was a bloodbath. The other team came out swinging, hitting us harder than we'd ever been hit before. Chappie took a brutal tackle midway through the quarter, one that left him crumpled on the field for what felt like an eternity. The crowd went silent as the trainers ran out to check on him. I was one of the guys who helped him to his feet. He was shaky, barely able to stand, but when I tried to lead him to the bench, he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I'm finishing. Chappie, I can't let them down." He shoved me away and stumbled back onto the field. I stood there, frozen, watching as he lined up for the next play. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were locked on the end zone, like nothing else existed. I don't think I've ever felt so helpless in my life. Every time Chappie took the ball, I wanted to scream, to run out there and drag him off the field myself. But I didn't. None of us did. We just stood there and watched as he pushed himself further and further, like he was trying to outrun something none of us could see. By the fourth quarter, he was barely holding it together. His breathing was ragged, and every step looked like it hurt. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. And when the final play came, with the score tied and the clock ticking down, I knew exactly who the ball was going to. The snap was clean. The line opened up just enough for Chappie to slip through, and then he was gone, tearing down the field like a man possessed. I could hear the crowd screaming, the pounding of cleats against turf, the thud of bodies colliding. Chappie dodged one defender, then another, stiff-arming a third as he barreled toward the end zone. It should have been a perfect run. But then, just as he reached the 5-yard line, one of their linebackers came out of nowhere, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. Chappie hit the ground hard, the ball tumbling out of his hands as he skidded to a stop. For a second, everything went quiet. Then the whistle blew, and the crowd erupted. But Chappie didn't get up. I was the first one to reach him. He was lying on his back, staring up at the sky, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were glazed, unfocused. "Chappie," I said, dropping to my knees beside him. "Can you hear me?" His lips moved, but the words were barely audible. I leaned closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "They're proud of me," he whispered. "I can feel it." "Chappie, stop." "They're watching," he said, his voice growing fainter. "I did it. I did it for them." Then his eyes fluttered shut, and the trainers were pushing me out of the way, shouting orders I couldn't make sense of. All I could do was stand there, my hands shaking, as they carried him off the field. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lying there, whispering to himself. And no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, I couldn't help but think of what he'd said, about the legends, about the monuments, about how they were watching. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The day of the regional championship dawned heavy with fog, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, quieter. The stadium, usually alive with the sounds of early morning setup, was oddly subdued. It was as if even the air knew what was coming. By game time, the fog had lifted, but the tension remained. The stands were packed with fans screaming themselves hoarse, their voices blending into a deafening roar. But beneath the noise, there was something else, an almost oppressive weight hanging in the air, pressing down on us all. Chappie stood at the center of it, his helmet tucked under one arm, his gaze fixed on the field. I don't know if anyone else noticed how pale he looked, or the slight tremor in his hands. If they did, they didn't say anything. All they saw was the star player who'd carried us this far. All I saw was a guy who looked like he was being swallowed whole. From the very first snap, Chappie played like he was on fire. It was like watching someone possessed, not just determined, but desperate. Every run, every throw, every tackle was perfect, almost inhumanly so. The crowd screamed his name, their voices merging into a single frenzied chant. "Chappie! Chappie! Chappie!" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he hit the ground, it took him a second too long to get back up. His breathing was labored, his movements just a hair too sharp, too strained. It was like he was running on fumes, and we were all just waiting for him to burn out. And then there were the moments when he'd glance toward the monuments. Just brief flickers, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. But I was. I saw the way his eyes lingered, the way his shoulders tensed, like he was carrying something far heavier than the expectations of a town. The game was brutal, a slugfest from start to finish. By the fourth quarter, we were tied, the clock ticking down. Chappie had been hit more times than I could count, but he kept going, his jersey streaked with mud and blood. He didn't speak to any of us, didn't look at us. It was like he was somewhere else entirely. And then came the final play. The huddle was silent except for the sound of Chappie's ragged breathing. The coach's voice crackled through the headset, calling for a run. Chappie didn't wait for anyone to question it. He clapped his hands, barked the cadence, and the ball was snapped. I'll never forget what happened next. Chappie took the handoff and exploded through the line like a missile, dodging defenders with an ease that felt almost unnatural. The crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to push him forward. I was running behind him, close enough to see the strain in his face, the way his lips were moving like he was talking to himself. 30 yards, 20, 10. The end zone was right there. And then I saw it, the linebacker closing in from the side. I opened my mouth to yell, but the words caught in my throat. Chappie didn't see him, didn't even glance that way. All his focus was on the goalpost, looming larger and larger with every step. The collision was brutal. The linebacker's shoulder slammed into Chappie's ribs, spinning him off balance. For a split second, he was airborne, his body twisting unnaturally as he hurtled toward the goalpost. The sound of the impact, a sickening crack, is something I'll never forget. It was the kind of noise that makes your stomach lurch, that tells you something is horribly, irreparably wrong. Chappie crumpled to the ground, motionless. For a moment, the entire stadium was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock or confusion, but something deeper, heavier. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Then the medics were running onto the field, and I was right behind them. Chappie was lying on his back, his eyes open but unfocused. Blood trickled from his nose, his lips staining the grass beneath him. "Chappie," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "Hey, stay with me, okay?" His lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "They'll remember me," he murmured. "I did it. For them." And then he was gone. The aftermath was a blur. The medics pronounced him dead right there on the field, their words barely audible over the rising murmur of the crowd. The cheering had stopped, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. People shuffled out of the stadium in a daze, their faces pale and haunted. The next few days were a nightmare. The school held a vigil. The team attended grief counseling, and the local papers ran tribute after tribute. But none of it felt real. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chappie lying there, whispering those final words. "They'll remember me." A month later, they unveiled his monument. It stood at the end of the row, just like he'd always wanted, his face immortalized in cold, unfeeling stone. The inscription read, "Chappie Halstead, number 50, the heart of the team." I didn't go to the ceremony. I couldn't. But I heard about it from the others, how the crowd gathered in hushed reverence, how the mayor gave a speech about sacrifice and greatness. They called him a hero, a legend, a symbol of everything Briar Ridge stood for. But to me, the monument was a tombstone. Every time I drove past the stadium, I could feel it watching me, its empty eyes boring into my back. I started taking different routes, avoiding the field altogether. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the weight of it. Now, years later, I can still hear his voice. In the quiet moments, when the wind rattles the windows, or the night stretches too long, He's there, whispering. They'll remember me. I think about those nights by the monuments, the way he used to stare at them like they held all the answers. Maybe they did. Maybe they were what pushed him, what drove him to give everything he had, and more. He got what he wanted in the end. He's remembered, immortalized. But sometimes I wonder if it was really him who wanted it, or if it was something else, something tied to those cold stone faces that seemed to draw us in and never let go. And now, I avoid the stadium. I avoid the monuments. But it doesn't matter, because no matter how far I run, I can still feel them, watching, waiting. And every time I hear his voice, I wonder if they're whispering to someone else now.